For centuries, mankind has searched nature for value, extracting more and more value from every element, reinvigorating and improving what has been achieved before. We have applied scientific knowledge for practical purpose in our industry. Introducing new rock technology, providing all the key strengths of stone. Powered by innovation, our next generation stone wool has extracted new additional value from dia-based stone. Now with a new composition, we have enhanced stone wool thermal properties to provide lower lambda performance, enabling our solution to be thinner, which helps you to save space. New rock technology, offering the lowest lambda stone wool insulation in the UK and Ireland. Discover New Rock.
Welcome to Net Zero Live, Building Magazine's two-day event looking at the challenges of delivering a net zero built environment. I am Thomas Lane, the technical editor of Building Magazine. This morning's webinar, which is sponsored by Rockwall, examines how we can close the performance gap. The performance gap is the difference between predicted energy performance and what happens in reality after the building has been completed and occupied. In some instances, the performance gap would be better described as a yawning chasm. Reducing this gap is essential to meeting our carbon reduction goals and, of course, keeping energy bills under control too. In this session, we will look at the ways in which the project team can look to reduce the performance gap in both residential and non-residential buildings. To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Peter Fisher, Director of Bennetts Associates, Jim Saywell, Director at Bureau Happold, Vicky Odili, Project Director at TP Bennett, and Alasdair Donn, the Head of Building Performance and Group Sustainability at Willmott Dixon. So the format of today's session is each of our four panelists will present for about 5 to 8 minutes. And once those presentations are over, we will take some questions from you, the audience. So please have your fingers poised over your keyboards, ready to answer any questions on the subject of the performance gap. So in terms of what our speakers are going to be covering, Peter will start first and we'll look back at some of Bennetts Associates projects from the past 20 years to see how these have performed with lessons taken onto new projects. We'll also suggest that neighbours could provide better performance outcomes than Part L. Following on from Peter, Jim will go into neighbours in more detail and discuss its application to a new build office in Manchester. Vicky will talk about the importance of using the right metrics in the design brief, and Alasdair will discuss closing the performance gap from a contractor's perspective and how this helped Warwick University realise the UK's most energy efficient leisure centre. So that's our speaker. So I'd like to welcome Peter as our first speaker. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I think I've obviously reached that point in my career where I'm doing the history slot at the beginning of a presentation, talking about the history of Bennetts Associates and some of the work that we've done on trying to close the performance gap. Where I was going to start actually was even pre-Bennetts Associates, and the attitude to post-occupancy evaluation goes back way further than our 35 years of since we were founded. And the project on screen at the moment is Wiggins Cheap at Basingstoke, Gateway 2, done by Arab Associates, for which one of our founders, Rab Bennetts, was the project architect. And he was incredibly keen to go back and revisited this building over a number of years to try and understand how it was working. It was one of the first naturally ventilated HQ buildings that was done in the UK. And I think that really helped establish, if you like, the culture of evaluation POE within Bennetts Associates. And that has been very important for us, as I said, even before the founding of the company 35 years ago. And these are just some of the projects that we've done quite detailed post-occupancy evaluation on over a number of years. Some of these are funded by the client body, some of them are actually funded by ourselves. And Edinburgh Informatics won the Doolin Prize, the Scottish equivalent of the Stirling Prize, and we used the prize money for that to carry out a very detailed building use studies evaluation by Bill Bordas of that building. The other two were carried out as part of, largely paid for by the client body. In fact, I think Thomas wrote up the Winchester building in Building Magazine many, many years ago. And I think from all of these projects and a number of others over the years, we've learned a great deal about how buildings perform. And probably every building has different lessons and to an extent different problems, but probably one of the most consistent things is that the simpler a building is and the easier it is to use, the more likely it will eventually hit its targets. The other lesson is that they often take some time to bed down. And in the case of Wessex Water, it took about 3 years for it to begin to hit the targets that it was originally aiming for. And that is then also part of an ongoing thing. With Wessex, we've been monitoring that now for 20 years. And we took the whole office to the building a few years ago, just before the pandemic, to meet the chief executive, who is still there. The same guy is still there, and said that he wouldn't change a thing, albeit there are one or two things that have changed, even though he said that they wouldn't change a thing. But there's a lot to learn from that, and he's trying to establish that culture of learning from buildings that is absolutely key, we think, to us improving, and also our buildings being used to the best that they can possibly be used. And one of the most important things that comes out of that is, as well as the buildings themselves performing better, is it gives us accurate data, which allows us to have accurate benchmarking. And over time, we've been able to use that data to fairly accurately predict probably where Paris-proof targets would end up going, and where the various alignment of different things, different targeting methods is coming from. And a lot of this will be pulled together as part of the net zero carbon building standard that's in evolution at the moment. And also, as I said, it enables better understanding of our work. And this is 5 Pancras Square for the London Borough of Camden, and that had very detailed occupancy evaluation done, which was related not only to energy consumption, but also to utilisation and the way that the building was occupied. So we know where people have a tendency to sit first if there's a choice, which bits of the building fill up, which bits are used. And that is incredibly valuable research currency for us. And it's part of the reason, the value of that, I find, is immeasurable for us as designers. So I do get frustrated when one of the constant questions about POE is who is going to pay for it. And I think there's a lot to be said for the experience that design teams themselves gain from having that work carried out. We gain as part of our research, it's even part of our IP to an extent. So we're very happy to finance that if need be. Now, as Tom said, I think one of the most important things that's happening at the moment is a move from demonstrating compliance to design for performance. I was initially asked to talk on the Part L panel, but I said I couldn't because I'm not really sure I think Part L brings very much, certainly not to projects that are trying to push the boundaries of net zero carbon. I think Neighbours offers a much better way of trying to genuinely predict what energy consumption the building will have, whereas Part L, the calculations that come out of it really aren't worth the paper that they're written on. It's come from Australia. There's going to be more detail on it in a little while. At the moment, I believe in the UK, it only covers offices and it only covers energy consumption. But in Australia, it covers a much wider remit: waste, water, carbon, and many different building types. But the key thing is it is related to the ongoing performance of a building. So it's got the Australians have got much more accurate at genuinely predicting what the energy consumption of buildings will be, and that is used to optimize. Now, part of the importance around that is that certainly for non-domestic clients, for office occupiers certainly in central London, it's becoming increasingly important because they understand their own energy performance, they understand their carbon profiles, and this brilliant graph by JLL, which is in the process of being updated, shows just the amount of floor space in central London that is occupied by tenants with science-based targets that is coming up to lease events. So people understand this, and the buildings are a very big part of a service-based company's carbon emissions. So that language is getting more and more important. Now just turning to a specific project. This is Timber Square in Southwark for Landsec, and it's a building that's just on site, a steel CLT hybrid structure with an existing building. But this was one of, or if not the first, I think, UK project to complete the DFP review. And what it did do was give us a great deal more confidence as a design team in the modelling that was being done, and therefore the value of optimization. And in places it saved quite a lot. There are fewer air source heat pumps than I think would have landed in older regimes, and it also enabled us to do quite a lot of work on optimizing facades in particular. And we just had much more confidence in this. And historically, I've always found it's quite difficult to get clear information out of service engineers. And that's been a big bugbear. The other one is, of course, architects tend not to listen to that information once they've got it. And it's very important that once we've got confidence in the information that we're getting out of models, that we use that much more diligently. And in the case of Timber Square, one of the main things was the way in which we were able to use the DFP model to enable us to optimize the facade glazing ratios as we move around the building. It's done quite discreetly as an architectural method, but the glazing ratios move as you move around the building. So they flip from about 80% glazing on the north facades to as low as 40 towards the top of the southern facades. As I said, it's done quite discreetly, but it has a huge impact on the energy consumption as we move around the building. And that has been a direct result of the neighbours and DFP process. So we're much more confident that that will somehow, will mirror more or less the actual energy consumption of the building. Is much more accurate, and the clients will be demanding of that. So that was the final slide, and I will now pass over to hear a bit more about neighbours.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. Just very quickly, before we move on to Jim, I just wanted to ask: looking back at all the buildings you've done, was there an area of the design and delivery process which came up again and again as a sort of serious contributor to that performance gap? I mean, for example, design predictions or maybe workmanship. But was there anything that stood out for you?
I think there were probably two, actually, and for a long time it was airtightness of the envelope and gaps between trade packages. I mean, literally gaps between trade packages and them not quite joining properly. It wasn't so much within individual systems, it's more the junctions and interfaces. And the second was the complexity of control mechanisms. I always remember Bill Bordas saying you can either have a simple building with simple controls, or you can have a complex building with complex controls. But unfortunately, what we normally get are complex buildings with simple controls. And really, we just need buildings to be as simple and as legible as they can possibly be, and to have controls that are intuitive and workable. And there's nothing more intuitive than a simple opening window with a handle.
Sure, great. All right, we'll return to this one in the Q&A maybe, but thanks very much, Peter. So I'm going to hand over now to Jim. He's going to talk in more detail about neighbours.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I'm going to get into a bit more detail on the neighbours and generally building performance in my 5 to 8 minute slide slot. So yeah, I'm Jim Saywell. I'm a director at Bureau Happold, building services engineer and building physicist, and I specialise in building performance, and I'm on the independent design review panel for neighbours, so I've got a vested interest in pushing it forward. So a very quick slide on why. I mean, everyone knows why who's on this webinar probably. We've got a climate crisis. We've also got an energy crisis. So we need buildings to start performing as we design them to. This is a slide that most people will have seen. I don't know if everyone in the audience will have seen it, but essentially what this is that each bar represents a building. The vertical axis is how much energy it uses, normalized per square meter. And the buildings have been grouped in their EPC rating category. And so this essentially shows two things: that one, you get a huge variation in energy use across a particular EPC rating. The second thing it shows is the average actual energy use, which is the green line, shows that there's little or no correlation between EPC rating and actual energy performance. This slide shows a similar thing, but provides you with a quantity on the difference between energy modeling versus actual use. It can go up to 10 times, almost 10 times, but the average is 3.8 times. So the average building uses 3.8 times more energy than the model in the design phase. So neighbours, Peter mentioned this, he's right, it's an Australian system that came over to the UK. At the moment, we only use for office buildings, and we can only get a base building energy rating. We're working towards a whole building energy rating, and we're working towards doing other building types. But for now, it's all down to the base building, which is the orange part. And essentially, that is everything in the building except for lighting and small power of the tenant spaces, things that aren't in the direct control of the landlord, plus some other things that can be excluded. But those are the big pieces. It's a 1 to 6 star rating system. Theoretically, there's a 7-star, 1 being a poor building, 3 being an average, and 6 being a market leading. And that correlates to roughly in terms of energy, a 3-star building, which is the average building. If a 5-star building uses half as much energy in the landlord side as a 3-star building, and a 6-star building uses half as much energy in the base build than a 5-star building. Why neighbours again? It's proven to work. In Australia, it's been mandated for office buildings over 1,000 square metres for over 10 years. During that time, they haven't mandated a performance rating. They've just mandated you have to do it. And they've seen their buildings go from pretty much where London's energy use is. This is the same kind of scale as before. The higher you are up on here, the higher the energy use. And they're now down there, so their typical buildings are consuming a lot less energy than we do in London. So that's very, very quick rundown on neighbours. Hopefully it was clear enough. I just want to give you a little bit of an example project to kind of give us a bit of scale on stuff. This is a project that I've been working on for a couple of years. It was originally designed in 2018, 2019, before Neighbours UK came out. It was a gas boiler building with air-cooled chillers, and then it was targeting the EPC B and BREEAM Excellent. But then the client decided in 2020 that they wanted to push the boundaries a bit and go for an EPC A, a BREEAM Outstanding, and target the new rating system of neighbours. It still hadn't been released when they decided they wanted to do it. And so we became a design for performance pioneer project, one of about a dozen projects that were pilots on a pilot scheme. So it's all electric, is probably the biggest thing that changed, but a number of other things have changed to kind of improve the performance, particularly around controls and metering. So this is going to add some meat on the bones of what Peter already said about Part L versus neighbours. So this is this represents the Bruckle information, the Part L results for 4 Angel Square. And that's the performance gap 3.8 that we mentioned. So if we now show the design for performance, now I don't know if we've actually defined that. So design for performance, neighbours is a scheme that is measured in operation. Design for performance is a means of targeting a neighbours rating for a new build or a major innovation. So this is what you do during design before you build it and before it's operating, so you can target a rating and market it. So this is showing a significant increase in the amount of energy that we expect compared to the Part L model already. But as you can see, there's still an enormous distance between where we predict the energy to be and where typical buildings are performing. And we do sensitivity analysis to get that kind of a low range and a higher range estimate. But even with one of the higher scenarios that we looked at, we're still quite a significant way from where buildings are typically performing. So what do you do in design to kind of narrow that gap down to the third that we saw on the previous slide? Well, of course, we talk about enveloping systems. That's probably a whole session in itself. But a big part of neighbours, probably as big, if not bigger than the design side, in terms of enveloping systems, is enabling efficient operation. So you need metering in place, you need the controls in place, and you need to be able to monitor the energy use. Otherwise, you don't know what you're using, and there's nothing you can do about it. Most of the performance gap sits at this end of the scale. The other thing to mention is a lot of buildings, commercial office developments, go through a single stage design build tender, REBA stage 3, which kind of complicates this whole process of iterative design and doing an independent review, which is required of a design performance project. And so that we need to figure out as an industry what the best way of doing this is, and how do we get in the requirements. Mickey's going to be talking about setting the brief, but this is almost like a brief for the contractor. How do we get the requirements in the contract and incentivize the contractor to continue with the performance focused approach? And another big element to making it difficult to hit energy use targets is control of the tenant. So that means that the design, the fit out, the commissioning of the tenant systems needs to be aligned to what the base build has done. And it's also about engaging the tenant in energy use. Now this slide is a bit of a dangerous one for me, because I only thought of this on the training and put this slide together just an hour before the presentation, so hopefully the numbers add up. But I wanted to put a sense of scale on why it's important from a financial point of view to hit the performance targets. So if you took a 20,000 square meter building, which is slightly bigger than 4 Angel Square, that MEPC's 4 Angel Square, and it hit a 50 kilowatt hours per square meter per year base build energy target, and keeping the numbers round, that's 1 million kilowatt hours a year. If you were paying 25p a kilowatt hour, which is a lot lower than I believe everyone's paying now, that'd be £250,000 for the energy bill for the landlord areas. Now, if you were to get nearer to the performance gap, so this is based on the design performance model, so roughly double that, you're at £500,000. So there's a difference between £250,000 between those two examples. Now, if you double the price of electricity, which is, I have no idea what most commercial developers are paying at the moment, but just for a sense of scale, it goes from, if you hit your energy targets for £500,000 to £1 million. So that's poor performance costs the landlord £250,000 to £500,000 for a 20,000 square meter building. Now, just to close out my session, I just want to highlight 3 things that are really important for closing the performance gap. Transparency, something I want to raise, is neighbours at the energy use and operation is encouraging transparency. There's a Grosvenor have got 2 buildings that they've rated under neighbours. One of them's a 4.5 star, which is very good performance for an existing building, and another one was 3. There's a lot of hesitancy in people getting neighbours ratings for existing buildings, probably driven by fear of having a poor performing building. But we can't improve if we don't know where we're at. So we need to kind of encourage this. One of the things that neighbours are looking at is potentially looking at anonymity for initial neighbours ratings. Focus on performance in design is another key one, which is kind of the obvious thing. And making sure we understand that performance doesn't stop at handover. And then my final one is incentivized performance. So the contractor needs to be incentivized for the building to perform. The building managers need to be incentivized. So we need to kind of figure out how we form that as part of how we're trying to achieve performance, incentivizing the tenants as well. And unlike a lot of energy saving measures from the past, closing the performance back really will pay back. And a building of this scale, it's a very large sum of money. And that's me, Tom.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. Just again, a quick question before we move on about neighbours actually. So, with the energy performance targets expressed in energy use in kilowatt hours per square metre per year, is it an absolute target? Does it make any difference where in the world you are? So in Australia, let's say 70, where it's very hot. Would you have the same target with the building, let's say, for the sake of argument, in the North Pole?
Yeah, you will. No. I mean, the energy you'd have to come across a. I mean, Neighbours UK is normalised for the UK climate, right? So the scale is there for our climate. There isn't a huge difference between, unlike you probably would imagine more of a difference between Melbourne and London than there is, but this climate would have a relatively small impact compared to with other things. If you change to Abu Dhabi or the North Pole, you're going to see a very large difference in energy use intensity. So you'd have to normalise the scale.
I see. No, that's great. Well, thanks for clearing that up. So, well, thanks very much, Jim. So now it's over to Vicky, who's going to talk about the brief and metrics. Thanks, Vicky.
Hi there. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can. Yeah, that's great.
Brilliant. My name is Vicky O'Dilly, Project Director at TP Bennett. So I am here today. I'm a sustainability coordinator within our in-house sustainability team. We actually have a team of 7 now supporting the rest of the business. So we can see that it's a growing area that we need to address. As Thomas introduced, I'm really here today to talk to you about what that means from the outset of the project. So for us, we have some key focus areas, and I really wanted to frame the discussion today around this 4-fold approach. We know that it's obviously sustainability is a wider issue than the operational carbon that we're focusing on today, that it's all about people at the heart of what we do. But really, when we're talking about bridging the performance gap today, we're talking about what that means in terms of the environment and how we can reduce and optimize the carbon usage. We know that we're all on a journey towards net zero carbon. TP Bennett have been working on this for quite some time. We've got the ISO 14001 environmental management system in place, and every project that we work on, we try and do better and challenge the client, challenge the brief, and try and advance our knowledge, the client's knowledge, and make a better building with every project that we do. Thankfully, we can see that the regulatory framework is catching up. To date, 75% of local authorities have declared a climate emergency. We're fortunate that a lot of the projects we work on are in London and Manchester, where the planning requirements are quite onerous. We know for quite some time we've been working to the London Plan energy hierarchy, which is addressing major developments and asking for whole life cycle carbon analysis. But we really welcome all of those climate emergencies that have been declared across the whole UK, and welcome all of the frameworks that will follow. We know that sometimes it's difficult, that there's a lot of cost involved with these, but I think it does, if we're talking about a carrot and a stick approach, it does help when people have this guidance to follow. The other thing we want to talk about is actually making this simple. I think for some potentially client teams, it can seem like a really onerous task. When we talk about net zero carbon, it can seem too hard, too challenging. What can they do? They just want to sometimes do as well as they did on the last project, which they felt was quite successful. And so one way is to break it down. Actually, what we're talking about is something that we can all understand. Yes, it is a step change in the way that we've done business, but if we guide the client team and collaborate with the design team, it's not something that's beyond the wit of man or woman. So what I want to talk to you is about confirming the project plan and the targets, using, if need be, some of the existing accreditation out there, so things that the industry is quite comfortable with, and then taking the steps towards minimising the embodied carbon emissions of the building, the operational carbon, before we start thinking about renewables and offsetting. And as Jim was saying with the case study in Angel Square, how important it is to make sure that we've got that be seen from the energy hierarchy, that we're collecting data, we understand how the building's performing, and we make sure we build that post-occupancy into the brief from the outset, so the client knows how important that is, that we've got all of that monitoring kit available, and we're able to go back and visit the building and understand. And we've got so much amazing guidance out there now, looking at the Letty guide for one example, where if you want to talk to the client about what kind of measures they need to put in place to reduce that operational carbon, then there's amazing guidance available. And actually, again, it's all things that we need to know what to do. And the difference with targeting net zero carbon is that we have to combine all of these things. We're not just talking about doing one of them in isolation. That it's one reason I really like this graph is it's this cumulative effect. And it's not, and none of this is possible without a good team of people around us. So in-house, we have this team. If we combine everyone's part-time days, we've got 7 people, but we also have champions across the business. So we make sure that we're continually upskilling the whole business and that every studio has a sustainability champion. So they have access to external training, make sure that they know what needs to be done for the project typologies that they're working on, because we both do the commercial interiors as well as architecture. So we need to make sure that knowledge sharing is really going across the business. So this is one of the case studies I'm going to bring to you today that has been undertaken by our Manchester team, Wellington Place and Leeds. Like the project that Jim presented, this is also a Design for Performance Pioneer project, and it's one of the first Neighbours 5-star outside of London, which I believe with Arup, that's something that Jim's team is aware of. And here I think I wanted to show this slide really just to say all of these things are accreditations that we're aware of, and it's when you combine all of these that you can actually get towards net zero carbon operational. So targeting BREEAM outstanding, making the most of that, making sure we're getting the post-occupancy element of that and we're feeding questions into it, targeting 2-star fit well, an all-electric building, maximising the renewable energy. But it really is, in terms of bridging the performance gap, it is the Neighbours accreditation that is doing that for us, that's keeping everyone's eyes on the prize, as it was. So this is it under construction, due for completion in 2023. You can see it's quite a constrained site. We've got some heritage buildings right next door. And this was one of those projects that was paused at the beginning of the lockdowns, and when it was picked up again, this is when we were able to review it and actually implement the Neighbours 5-star. As Peter was talking about, we looked at options for reducing the amount of glazing. At the moment, it's around 63%. Unfortunately, because planning was already in place, it was felt it was a risk to change the aesthetic of it too much. But still within that percentage of glazing, we've been able to achieve as it's going at the moment, the Neighbours 5-star as it's progressing on site. So this graph is from Arup, looking at how it compares against the UK GBC energy performance targets. So you can see it's on track for something that's doing quite well. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me about these graphs is that we can see that we've got a long way to go. If we look at the baseline of where we were when this design was done a few years ago to where we are now, this is where you really need the whole design team on board. Everyone has to be collaborating to be able to do this, to highlight where those thermal bridges are so that everyone understands the modelling and the input, so that we know how to solve those, how to make those simple designs work effectively and minimise all the thermal bridging. So this is it as the vision is in future, which, as I say, we're not too far off, due for completion in 2023. But here I think the success has been that we were able to reevaluate the project and build those clear metrics into the brief and bring the client and the design team along on that journey. So another way that we're talking to clients about what it can mean to target sustainability for their project is actually having a tiered approach. So here we've got a exemplary, then we've got it's like a good, better, best. So this is the tier 1. And this is really just as an example to say it doesn't have to be about accreditations. You can, with some clients, we're looking at a shopping list of options. Clients who say they're not that bothered about their accreditations, they actually just want to get the outcomes. They want to meet those lower operational and embodied carbon targets. But this is one helpful way if you're guiding a client along that discussion. If they have an ESG strategy in place, but perhaps there's a disconnect between their strategy and the actual project that you're reviewing, then playing back to them, well, this is what you're talking about in terms of social value, moving towards net zero, and this is what it means on the project. So as you can see, when we go down to the mid-level, in terms of the targets, that we're emitting some or we're loosening it slightly, and then some minimum, which we're hoping we don't get to. We always want to be really at the good, we want to be at the better and best, above the good, but for some clients the good is still a step change from where they are currently. And then just to wrap up for me, a couple of images from a recent case study. So this is one that's in London, a office retrofit, which has been quite challenging, partly because the client has been on their own ESG journey. So as we were being briefed, they were also developing their ESG strategy. So the metrics weren't clear from the outset. So it's been a bit of a movable feast, but I think now we can say that we're in a really good place. It's in for planning. And actually, although it is covered in a green wall, that's not to say that is the solution for every project. We made sure actually we were quite robust about specifying something with a low water, with a high water efficiency, low water use in terms of that green wall, but it was something that was quite important to the client. So again, it's playing back to them what they think is important and what they want to see. They want to see real biodiversity on the facade of that building. But this is that really every project should have its own sustainability story, and not just a nice story to sell to the shareholders. Actually, what is the story when you add up all of those elements that have been implemented? How are they getting towards net zero carbon? What have they done? And the last couple of slides is just to say that we're not forgetting about embodied carbon. So at TP Bennett, we have developed a responsible sourcing process. So it's a web-based application where we talk to suppliers about these 7 different areas. This is one way we're bridging the gap by actually engaging with the suppliers at an early stage and really understanding what it means for them and removing some of that opacity that's traditionally been around the supply chain. So while, again, this discussion today is about the operational carbon and making sure we're reducing that using all those accreditations like NABERS to their best advantage, we're not forgetting about the embodied carbon, and we're doing what we can to tackle that so that we get some really great performing buildings. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much, Becky. And again, a quick question for you before we move on. I mean, there's actually seems to be an incredible number of different metrics out there now. We mentioned LETI, obviously there's NABERS as well, fit well, and the list gets longer and longer and longer. I mean, is it just making your job just much more complicated? I mean, obviously we want to achieve these goals, but is it mean that your job is going to take a lot longer and you're going to need more people to achieve these outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's a challenge at the moment because people understand accreditations, and for a lot of people the badge is important. I think we want to make sure that we're picking the right accreditations for the right project, and it's probably partly how my role has evolved in that we are actually physically bridging the gap. So we're not replacing the external sustainability coordinators, we're bridging the gap between those external people who are doing the NABERS assessments, who are doing the BREEAM, hopefully heading for that outstanding, and the design team who are trying to do their best and keep up with all of this plethora of accreditations. So I think they can be used well if they're handled carefully. So I don't want to dismiss them. Yes, you're right, it would be more useful if it was simplified, and I think we will see that in the very near future. But at the moment, I think it's picking the best accreditation to suit the project.
Right, thanks very much, Vicky. So we're moving now on to our last presenter, Alasdair, who's going to talk about the performance gap from the contractor's perspective. So over to you, Alasdair.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, and hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes.
Yes, excellent, thank you. I'd just like to add to those excellent introductions to the importance of building performance, just by giving a little bit of a perspective from a main contractor standpoint. Willmott Dixon is delivering large buildings to the public sector and private sector in the UK, and I guess it's been highlighted already by Peter and Jim, some of the challenges that when a design process moves into the delivery phase. I'd just like to say a little bit about why it's important for us that performance is achieved. our customers, it's a crucial thing for them that we deliver all the way through the delivery chain of a project, from design through build into construction into operation, buildings that actually deliver on energy performance expectations and net zero carbon expectations. If we don't do that, we don't meet the customer's needs, and we don't meet the planet's needs. You know, those things are important. I think that philosophy and that mindset permeating the whole delivery chain in construction, that's important, I think, and that we all have that feedback loop, and that we all live with the performance of the projects that we are delivering. So I'd just like to share a few examples of some of those projects where we've been on that journey in Willmott Dixon. So the first project that we really had a major focus on energy performance was the project we delivered for University of Leicester in 2016. It's a large academic building, and the university, as well as is specifying a passive house performance target for the project, they also had a very appropriate focus, and we were challenged to rise to that focus on energy performance in use. And you can see there a performance tracking system that we developed at the time using simple Excel-based approaches on a specific focus on targeted performance, comparing targeted with actual performance on a fairly granular detail level, as you can see, on a monthly basis with performance targets by subset of projects. And what that really enabled us to focus on was the real importance on achieving a transparency of targeted versus actual performance. And we followed that process through a soft landings exercise with the customer over a process of 18 months to 2 years and further. And you can see there that the performance target achieved, the display energy certificate of that the customer was aiming for was achieved on that project through a process of feedback, monitoring and optimization. And that project was successful in winning a CIBSE award for its performance at that time. So from that learning, we really sort of tried to take that benefit, that experience in really focusing on measuring performance versus targets through further projects, which I'll show you in a second. Just to highlight though, before we leave that, the spectacular impact of a building which performed well to a very high standard, in this case passive house, compared to historic assets in the university's estate. And those energy costs are based on historic data and would be substantially different in difference now with current energy costs, of course. So from that experience with the University of Leicester and one or two other projects with our key customers, we realised that really for all of our projects that we're delivering in the business and that we're working with design teams on to deliver, we needed a process that focused on performance from the outset. So we now have a process that we apply to all of our projects called Energy Synergy, and really that is an energy performance plan development process, very similar and in fact in many ways very parallel to the approach that Neighbours takes, and we'll touch on that a little later. But that energy performance plan is developed in detail. It's a holistic plan including all of the energy use categories of the building, both regulated and unregulated, and it evolves through the development of the process using this CIBSE TM54 methodology. And that allows us to create the most accurate and appropriate plan of total energy performance at the point of handover that we then use to track performance against in operation and get some feedback directly on how the building's performing relative to its expectation levels. I'll just show you how that was applied in the University of Warwick project that we delivered a couple of years ago. We've been tracking that now in performance for since that time using the Energy Synergy process, and you can see some of the representations of that performance, comparing targeted with actual performance on a number of energy categories. And one I'd just like to highlight just to show some of the lessons. You can see there on the small power, one of the small power graphics, that there's a significant performance gap there between targeted and actual performance. That allowed us to identify with further data, as you can see bottom right there, the performance profile of energy consumption over a typical day, and that was largely associated with gym equipment and understanding fully the standby mode operation functionality of that equipment. But this building contained one of the largest gyms in the UK in terms of sports centre operation, and that material change in optimizing that out of hours consumption with standby power, passive power use was quite a significant opportunity for saving with the university. And you can see there that some idea of the overall scale of the savings that we identified through applying the energy synergy process. And I think rather than hear that story from me, if you have the opportunity to listen to our customer from the estates department talking about that and how the process was of value to the university in managing their estate, then I'd encourage you to take that opportunity. Just to round off with coming back to Peter and Jim's and Vicky's touching on neighbours, we're also engaged in delivering our first couple of neighbours projects. The project illustrated there, 19 Cornwall Street in Birmingham, also outside London, and encouraging that real estate sector is moving very strongly towards neighbours as a performance approach. That's targeting a 5-star rating as a refurbishment project, which is somewhat unusual. And I think really illustrates the value and benefit of us as a contractor delivery, working collaboratively with the design team to deliver that for the customer, and obviously tracking that in operation through processes like energy synergy, as I've highlighted. Under certain public procurement frameworks, and we are a member of the SCAPE framework, where we deliver a lot of complex projects to the public sector. We have actually collaborated with the framework organisation to create a contract model which is specifically embodying performance aspects and performance tracking and measurement and contractual consequences as a result. And that's a really encouraging move, I think, from large procurement frameworks to really put a focus on developing great buildings, delivering great buildings, and making those buildings perform to their expectation levels. So thanks very much for that, and I think we'll move now back to Thomas, who's going to take us through some questions.
Great, thanks very much, Alasdair. So yeah, then that concludes the formal presentations. So if everyone would like to put their cameras on, we can sort of start moving into a sort of Q&A session. But actually, my first question has come up from some of our listeners. One for you, Alice, and also anyone else chip in as they feel fit. I mean, Peter raised the issues around the interfaces between different trades, and that's one area where you're going to get possibly reduced performance. So I'm interested, Alice, to hear how you're tackling that to ensure that build quality is maintained on site. But also, I'm kind of interested to know how, obviously Willmott Dixon, I'm sure you've got very rigorous QA procedures in place, but that's not necessarily true of all contractors. And I guess as you get down to smaller projects, that might be an issue as well. So we're also interested to know what what people think we could do about that. So I guess Alasdair first.
Yeah, that's a fair question and a correct challenge for us as the delivery partner. Yes, we do have, as you expect, we have very rigorous processes to control those and to achieve those project outcomes at the point of completion of air tightness and other quality and interface aspects. The important thing, though, is that the buck doesn't stop there. That whilst we might have met all those contractual obligations, and I'm sure every contractor of quality would do so, we need to go beyond that. We need to go to the point where we are working collaboratively, as I've just shown in some of those examples, with our customer and with the design team to deliver correct operational performance to the expectation targets through the life of the building in its occupation phase. And that's the bit that traditionally we've not not gone beyond, and that's the structural change I think that needs to occur in the industry going forward. We've seen how it's developed successfully in Australia through neighbours, and I think the UK can do everything Australia can do, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. I mean, has anyone else got any thoughts on sort of issues around build quality and the performance gap? before we move on to the next question? No?
I would say I think that's got better, and a lot of it is about design management, and I suppose in a sense both the design team and the contractor taking it seriously and not just trying to pass responsibility off onto the other party. I would say as well, a lot of our earlier projects were construction management, and I think that was at one point more difficult with interfaces because you had a whole series of separate trade contracts rather than a single main contractor.
Yeah, single design and build, yeah, responsibility.
It's interesting, isn't it? The procurement route can really have an impact on the.
Yes, I don't think that's not the case now with construction management. We are doing some of that, but that was definitely a thing at that point in time.
Right, I see. And I mean, I guess the other thing which is sort of maybe difficult to control is occupier behaviour. And I saw, Alice, obviously, you're working, with occupiers to sort of reduce their energy demand. But I mean, it's quite a risk, isn't there? I mean, people come in, they open the windows in a building with openable windows, leave them open when they shouldn't, and obviously plugging, plugging fan heaters into small power sockets, all those sorts of things. I mean, how do we tackle that? I mean, particularly if you're contractually on the hook. I mean, does that help?
Yep, indeed. Well, I mean, there's no easy answer to that question, but I think everyone recognises that any building performance outcome is a combination of the building and its fabric, its building services, its controls, and its occupation settings and behaviours. And I think we have to recognise that. We have to get better at refining processes such as continuing review of targeted energy performance levels in operation if there are major changes in occupancy pattern or tenant behaviour or tenant fit out equipment and so on. Then those benchmark models for comparison of targeted versus actual have to change to reflect those, so that we're really getting as close to an accurate and fair comparison of intended versus actual performance. And I think there's some experience of that process occurring through neighbours. I don't know, others may have experience of that they can share.
And I suppose, I mean, how significant is that occupier behaviour part of the picture? I mean, is it not make much difference to the overall energy use for a building, or could it really tip it from being a good performing building to something quite bad?
Yeah, it can make a massive difference, right? I mean, the things like the lighting and the equipment power being excluded from the rating do soften the blow from the landlord point of view. But things like Alasdair was just saying about out of hours occupancy, you've got to do things that you have to have things in place. And part of the review process in neighbours is creating a rating achievement plan, so that it goes beyond the handover. So it's talking about building operation. How are you going to manage tenant fit outs? How are you going to ensure that they commission the systems properly? Things like bringing in MEPC are talking about considering bringing in green leases for Wellington Place and for Noma to try and get the right kind of tenant in the building. And then back to transparency is giving them an idea of how much energy they're using and what they can do to reduce it, rather than just getting a bill at the end of the month.
And,
can I on that one briefly, Thomas? One of the I didn't mention it in our case studies. We're actually doing a review of our existing building. We're just off Southwark Bridge Road, and it's a brick kind of warehouse style building. And actually, of all the things that we could do to improve the operational energy of this building, because at the moment it's single glazed critical windows on some of the facade, the thing that would make the biggest difference would be to consolidate the floors on the days where the office is not so busy, perhaps on a Monday and a Friday. Actually shut down whole floors makes more of a difference than double glazing the whole building.
Right, that is interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Effective use of space. And I guess that's you're alluding to what you're saying is that obviously a lot of companies now, their offices, particularly on Fridays, are like virtually deserted. So that's obviously a very good point to make. And I was going to mention, I mean, soft landings was touted for a number of years as a very effective way of helping address the performance gap. With neighbours, is that, and obviously your approach, Alasdair, do you think soft landings has had its day, or is there still a role for it?
No, absolutely not. Soft landings, although it may not be mentioned by name necessarily, the philosophy of soft landings of improving operational performance through feedback and evaluation, both human and energy, if you like, that's you know, completely aligned with performance achievement processes like Neighbours. It may be slightly narrower in that it's focused particularly on energy and carbon performance, whereas soft landings is perhaps a little bit wider, more looking at more occupancy and internal environment quality and things as well. But I think the two are perfectly aligned, and I think the value in soft landings processes, as we used in the Leicester project, as you saw there, they were really beneficial on it from the human and occupancy feedback standpoint, as well as on energy.
Thanks. Neighbours, is there any sort of consideration? Do they have carbon factors in Neighbours, or is it simply an energy metric in terms of you know, energy used per kilowatt hour per square metre per year? And if it is only just an energy metric, isn't there a bit of a danger of people just sort of installing, I know you could put in gas boilers, couldn't you? And they wouldn't really be penalised for that. And I know there's an issue. There's a few. You would be. How does that work then?
Well, it's a bit of a detailed question for a couple of minutes, but essentially it's kilowatt hours equivalent, and there is a factor on gas, which is roughly worked out to make sure that gas boilers are disincentivized in the ratio, when you account for the efficiency of a heat pump and the electricity factor, and the gas being much lower efficiency, but having a slightly lower factor, it does disincentivize gas use. You will not be able to get as good a rating with a gas boiler as you can with an air source heat pump, for example.
Right, I think a key point there as well, Tom, is of course that carbon factors for electricity, not for gas, but for electricity, change year on year. And so you have information recorded as carbon emissions. It becomes almost impossible to compare year by year, whereas the most simple way of recording information is, first of all, kilowatt hours per meter squared, and to then convert into anything else that you need. I mean, that a clean baseline is really important, I think.
Okay. I mean, thinking about Part L again, I mean, do you think, how many of our panel think that it's time to scrap Part L and maybe look at extending Neighbours to other building types?
Yeah, I'll put my hand up for that. Well, certainly a much greater emphasis on design for performance. I think the compliance model, particularly the notional building, just seems daft. The notional building has no influence on the building form, which is probably the biggest thing that you can alter. And to then just pair it with a certain set of U values just gives very, very misleading results. As you know, Jim, I've always said it's twofold. I'm looking at Jim, there's actually 3.8-fold, so I need to revise my sort of mental note of how inaccurate Part L is to what you actually get out at the other end. So I certainly think for bigger projects, it's not fit for purpose.
No, and it's as Peter said, it's not really driving the right behaviours. It's not driving overall reduction of energy consumption and carbon emissions.
And what about the future home standard and domestic Part L? No, there's not a notional building there. Is that sort of still useful?
I've absolutely no idea. I'm not really involved in that world, if I'm perfectly honest.
Well, I've understood. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's some good things happening with the domestic Part L. I think it is making steps in the right direction. We would like to perhaps see it be more onerous, but I think that will come.
Just to say, sorry, Vicky, to add a little bit, yes, I agree. In the domestic field, we're a member, along with many other industry partners, of a group that's responding to the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities to show them ways in which a better version of Future Homes 2025 might look, and various potential contender specifications. So that work's happening at the moment as part of the sort of run up to revising Part L.
Interesting, great. Well, thanks very much, Alasdair. And actually, I'm afraid the hour has flown past. We're out of time now. We could probably talk all day on this topic. It's a really interesting one, but sadly we've got to all move on. But I'd like to thank everybody for their time. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. And just like to say to our audience that there will be a short video after we disappear. So thanks to everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
For centuries, mankind has searched nature for value, extracting more and more value from every element, reinvigorating and improving what has been achieved before. We have applied scientific knowledge for practical purpose in our industry. Introducing new rock technology, providing all the key strengths of stone. Powered by innovation, our next generation stone wool has extracted new additional value from dia-based stone. Now with a new composition, we have enhanced stone wool thermal properties to provide lower lambda performance, enabling our solution to be thinner, which helps you to save space. New rock technology, offering the lowest lambda stone wool insulation in the UK and Ireland. Discover New Rock.